Hello, friends. Welcome back to Ghost Stories with Spooky Ms. T.I. It's nice to be back. It's been a little bit of a while yet, so I'm glad that we have a chance to do this again. Tonight, I'm going to be telling a story that isn't really a ghost story, although it does definitely deal with the other world. So I suppose it fits. I come from a long line of spooky. My ancestors have all been a little bit of spooky and have just accepted that there are things beyond what we can hold in our hand and what we can touch or see with our eyes, but there are things well beyond that. So tonight I'm going to tell you a story that I learned from my great grandmother. And this is the true story of Annie Murphy and the Leprechaun. Now, I know that this is a true story because my great grandmother was Annie Murphy. And my great grandmother told this story and told us it was true. My great grandmother did not lie. As a matter of fact, on her deathbed, she died when she was 99 years old. And she asked for a priest for absolution because when she was in her 20s in Chicago, she was given an extra penny in change on from the streetcar. And so she didn't give the penny back, and she felt guilty about that her whole life, and she did not want to have to take that with her to her grave. So for her to tell this story, and I heard it multiple times from her, I believe her. I believe it's true. I've seen things in the other world, as I know many of you have as well. And so this is the story of Annie Murphy and the Leprechaun. It starts way back in the middle of 2 centuries ago. Annie Murphy was born in 1865 in Chicago. Her parents, Bridget Murphy, and her husband, I can't remember his name. Anyway, they had emigrated from Ireland, and actually from Canada. They went from Ireland to Canada and then Canada to Chicago. And they traveled with another family from County Cork, where they were from. And Annie was born in 1865. And the story actually starts in 1871 because the story starts with another monumental event in Chicago. In October of 1871, the summer of 1871 had been hot and dry, hotter and drier than anyone could remember. They hadn't had rain for weeks and weeks. And it was October, it was early October, and the heat had not yet broken. You know how in the fall you get those first fall days and the cool air comes in and it's such a relief? Well, in early October in 1871, that had not yet happened. Everything was so dry. And the city at that time was largely frame and timber buildings. So with roofs that were waterproofed with tar. So the city of Chicago was a tinderbox, just waiting for something bad to happen. And on October 8th of 1871, the night of October 8th, something very bad did happen. And a fire began. The fire began, and it was so dry that sparks from the first building, they have an idea of where it began on Devon. It doesn't matter. But the first building that caught fire sent sparks to the building next to it, and sent sparks to the building next to that. And the fire department came, and they tapped into, at that time they even had some wooden water mains in the city, but they mostly had tanker trucks, pumpers that the workers they'd fill with water, they'd pump water from the lake even, and fill the tank and then spray it on the fires. Well, it happened so quickly and everything was so dry that it very quickly got out of hand. and jumped from building to building to building until the entire neighborhood was ablaze. And the whole side of the city, it just spread and spread, and people started running to get away from the fire. Well, Annie was 6 years old at this time, and she got up and she smelled smoke through the night, and she thought, oh, there must be a fire someplace. And then she heard the bells, and she heard the sound of the bells, the warning bells from the big buildings down in the city center, and she knew something was going on. But she came down. They had a little house. They had a wagon, a horse, a garden. They had a root cellar. This little plot of land was right where the First National Bank in Chicago is now. So she comes down, and her mother's not in the kitchen, and there's nothing going on. Usually the fire would be started in the stove, and breakfast would be being prepared, and coffee being made, or tea, but no one was in the house. And she heard this commotion outside, so she went out, and she saw her mom and her dad, her mother and father, standing in the yard, and her mother was in her apron, and it's still hot, and it's smoky. And she notices that the Lyons family are in a wagon in their yard, and their wagon is filled with all stuff, including the sons, and all kinds of stuff. And she goes running up to her mother and says, Mama, what's happening? And her mother shushed her, and she listened to the men talk. And Mr. Lyons said, Murphy, load your wagon as fast as you can, hitch up your team, and get out across the river. The fire is moving faster than a man can run. And she looked to the south, and there she saw a wall of flame as far as she could see, with billowing smoke all the way into the sky. When she told this story, I remember the last time I heard it, she was in her 90s, and she was this little old lady with white hair, teeny little thing. She'd been shrunk her whole life. She looked like a little leprechaun herself. And she said it looked like the devil himself had come to Chicago and brought all the fires of H-E double hockey sticks with him. And my eyes were wide listening to her tell this story. Well, Murphy, her father, said, I'm not leaving this. I can't leave. I can't just abandon this. This is all I have in the whole world. You go. I'm going to batten down the hatches, get things ready here, and I'll meet you on the other side of the river. We'll go across Wacker Street and cross the river right there, and you wait for us, and we'll meet you over on the other side. And he said, but take Annie with you. And Annie is like, no, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And her father just lifted her up and put her in the back of the wagon. And she's like going, Mama, I don't want to go. And she's 6 years old. And she sees these people are walking past the house, running past the house. There's this huge commotion. There's pandemonium. People just trying to get away from this great catastrophe happening in the city. And she didn't want to be separated from her parents. And he said, we'll meet you on the other side of the bridge. Just go with the Lyonses. Don't worry, we'll be fine. And she was distraught. Her mother took the shawl off of her own shoulders and wrapped her little girl up in it. She had her little doll that her mother had made for her. She had the shawl, her mother's shawl, and she was sitting in the back of the wagon just sobbing as Mr. Murphy turned the horses and headed out into the fray of all the people heading north to get across the river from the encroaching fire. She said, and I'll never forget the look in her eyes when she said this. She said, the most horrible sight I've ever seen in my whole life, and I can picture it in my mind's eye all these years later, was the look of my mother and my father running back to the house. And before my mother entered the house, she turned around and she waved to me and she blew me a kiss. And I didn't know if that would be the last time I'd ever see her, because coming towards them was the wall of fire. Well, she went with the Lyons family, and she was distraught. And her friend Tommy, who was a couple of years older than her, he was 7, maybe 8, maybe 9 years old. He said, "Don't worry about it, Annie. Let's pray that they'll be safe, and I know they'll be fine, and I'll take care of you, and no matter what happens, I'll take care of you. You're safe, you're with us, and I'm sure your mother and father will be right behind us. Just let's say a prayer together, and we'll make it across the river, and we're all going to be safe. Well, meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Murphy, my great-great-grandparents, went running back to the house. And what they did was pretty brilliant, because the fire was jumping from roof to roof to roof. And so they went in the house and they got every blanket, pillow, rug, anything that they could put in the pump and soak with water. And they had a big barrel by the pump and throwing it in. And then Mr. Murphy, my great-great-grandpa, he was taking the stuff and throwing it up on the roof. And then they took buckets of water and put it on the side of the house and drenched the whole roof, so it was dripping wet, and so that if any sparks landed, they would be put out by the wet. Hopefully, that was the plan. And then they were going to hitch up the horse. The horse was already hitched up. They were going to then take off and meet the Lyonses on the other side of the river. But by the time they finished this job, they looked, and the fire was not more than a block away. And it was coming so fast, and that they could feel the heat of it. And so they decided that instead of trying to make a run for it, they freed the horse, and the horse just ran. And they went down in their root cellar. And they took one rug, soaked it with water. They took a bucket of water down in the root cellar with them. They put that rug, closed the door and put that rug over the root cellar door, because a fire needs oxygen to survive, and a fire will suck oxygen out of a place and you could suffocate. So they wanted to keep the smoke and the fire out of the root cellar. And they got down there and they got down on the floor and they waited. And Annie said that her mother told her it sounded like 1,000 streetcars going over, 1,000 trains going over their head, the roar of the fire and the crackling of the fire. And it got so hot in the root cellar, even with it closed, they were all the way on the floor, and they could feel the heat of the fire even on the floor of the root cellar. And as the fire passed over, the jars on the shelf, she had canned vegetables in jars on the shelf in the root cellar, began to pop and explode from the heat above them. And they covered themselves with a blanket, and they kept putting water on themselves. And they stayed low, and they stayed there, and they stayed there, and they stayed there for 3 days. Meanwhile, Annie and the Lyons family got to the bridge to cross the Chicago River. The Chicago River is a really wide river right there in that area, right next to the lake. And everybody thought that if you got across the river, you would be perfectly safe, that fire would never make it across the river. So they got to there, and there were 1,000 people in queue to cross the river, in line, waiting and waiting and waiting to get across the river. Meanwhile, the fire is coming closer and closer, and they're waiting, and finally they start across the river, and they found a place on a little bit of high ground where they could watch the rest of the people come across the river. And other people had set up their wagons or set up their stuff and were sitting along the banks of the river watching their city and their home burn. And Annie and Tommy stood up on the wagon seat watching for Annie's mom and dad. And she says, I don't see him, I don't see him. And Tommy said, it's okay. I know they'll be safe. They'll be coming across any minute now. And pretty soon, after quite a bit of time, maybe when they were across the river, they heard a commotion west, upriver, downriver. And they heard people starting to shout, and they saw this commotion breaking out. And everybody turned and looked, and people were screaming, run for your lives. The fire's jumped the river. Run for your lives. Every man for himself. And people start running, and they look. And sure enough, the wind had picked up because of the heat of the fire and the coolness of the lake. There was this vortex created. And the sparks from the burning buildings on the south side of the river blew across this block-wide river and were landing in trees and buildings on the north side of the river. Well, Tommy, or Mr. Lyons, and said, we need to go. And Annie's like, no, my mother and father haven't made it across. We have to wait for them. We have to wait for them. They said, they'll find us. It'll be fine. We'll be safe. We have to go. We can't wait here. The fire is going to cross the river at us. But they haven't made it across. And she's like, oh, I'm sure they're burned up in the fire. I'll never see them again. And again, Tommy consoled her and said, they're safe. I know they're safe. I know it in my heart. Let's ask the Virgin Mary to protect them and to protect us. But right now we got to get in the wagon and we got to get out of here. So they turned and people were just running like pandemonium. And they just kept moving until they reached a big grassy area where there was no longer anything to burn, and got way past there. It was all the way up by Lincoln Park now, along the lake. And people were getting up there and just watching their whole world go up in flames. Well, the fire burned for 3 days. There was nothing anyone could do. On the third day, it began to rain. By that time, the U.S. Army had come, and they had brought big tents and mess tents, and it was an enormous refugee camp with everybody who had run from the fire just sitting on the ground, sitting in, grateful for the rain, but devastated and traumatized, and people were lost, and people didn't know where their family was or where their children were, for that matter. And Annie was distraught, but Tommy stayed right with her. And when they went to the mess tent that the army had set up to get their water and their cup of, their plate of soup or whatever it was, he made sure that she got enough to eat and that she was served first. And he made sure she ate, and he stayed by her. When at night, when she would whimper, he would stroke her back and say, it's all right, Annie. You're not alone. You're with us. You're safe. I'm sure your mother and father are safe too. And this went on for quite some time. Meanwhile, Annie's mom and dad stayed in that root cellar for the 3 days until they heard a sound that Annie described like a giant snake slithering across the city. She said her mother told her it was a mighty hiss as the rain fell and began to put out the embers. Everything was gone. All that was left was charcoal. Nothing left. And they waited, and they took the blanket or the rug off of the cellar door, felt the door, and it was cool, and they heard the rain falling, and they opened the door. And when they walked out, they thought that they had died and gone to hell, because nothing was recognizable around them. Everything was completely burnt out. You couldn't tell where the street was. You couldn't tell what block you were on. Everything was just black and seething with this acrid smell of burnt everything. But their house, their little house, was spared right there. And if you go to the Chicago Historical Society, they have a whole basement display on the Great Conflagration or whatever, and you can see the Murphy house that survived that fire. That was a janky candle that just dropped a big drop of. Speaking of fire, I gotta put that out. Ooh, not like that. Anyway, so when Annie's mom and dad came, I'm finding tools to put out this burning piece of candle that fell. There we go. Fortunately, it fell in the candle holder. No great fire here tonight. Although I forgot to do something first. And when little things go wrong when you telling leprechaun stories, it's time to back up. And if you have a libation with you, let's raise a toast to the wee folk and to those that dwell in the other world and give them our respect and honor them and hope for the best for the rest of the night. Sorry, I forgot to start that way. Well, the Murphys came out of the cellar and tried to figure out how to get to the river. And they started from their porch, from their front door, because they knew which direction would be north from there. And they just made their way through rubble and burnt out everything. And they finally, after hours, weaving their way north toward the river. It was raining, so they couldn't see the sun for direction, but they knew if they just kept going this way, they would get to the river. And when they reached the river, the bridge that the lions had crossed, the bridge on which the other side they were supposed to meet up with their little girl and with their friends, was nothing but stone and steel frame. The bridge itself had completely burned, and everything beyond the river was blackened and burned as well. And Mrs. Murphy panicked. Oh, Lord, please, Tommy, or her husband, she says, I don't want our daughter, I'm sure she's been burnt up in the fire. I'm never going to see my baby again. Oh, this is a terrible place. I don't want to be in this place. I don't want to do this anymore. And her husband said, Mrs. Murphy, it will be all right. We'll find her. They wouldn't just sit there and let her burn up. I'm sure they've gone to where it's safe. We just have to make our way there. Well, they walked to the lake, and there was no place to cross. They had to go way west, and they found people that were ferrying folks across on rowboats. And they made it across the river, and they're on foot, and they start walking through the burned out. They went along the lake until they started seeing the camps. There were soldiers, and there were people that were help guiding them to where the refugee camps were. And they went to the first camp, and they said, we're looking for a family. They're from County Cork in Ireland. They're the Lyons family, and they have a little girl with them, little Annie. She's 6 years old. Have you seen him? Has anybody seen him? And they're like, no, nobody's seen him. Well, they searched for, I think she said like 2 weeks is as long as it took. And then finally, in the camp, they were sitting by the wagon, just she and Tommy sitting there, and she was holding her little doll, and they were doing tic-tac-toe in the dirt in front of them, when she looked up and she saw her mother and father running toward her. And she said, my mother picked me up and squeezed me so hard, like to squeeze the life out of me. I said, Mama, put me down. You're going to break me bones. And her mother said, I'm never letting you go again. And she turned to her husband and she said, I don't want to stay here any longer. This is a terrible place where you could lose your child for weeks on end. No, I want to go back. I don't care if we're hungry there. I don't care if we have nothing there. We have nothing here. Let's go back and live with my mother. Just, I need to get away from here. And Mr. Murphy said, very well, Mrs. Murphy. So what they did is they sold that property, figuring that the city would never rise again because, they sold the property for enough money to get them back to Ireland. And there they went. Annie's father ended up dying of smallpox very young. So it was her mother and her that, I think he got it right about that time. He was like in his early 30s. So I'm not sure of the exact date, but it was right. But he did not go to Ireland. So he either stayed back and died of smallpox, or... So Annie and her mother went to Annie's grandmother's cottage in County Cork. And there, she loved to listen to her grandmother tell stories of the wee folk, of the Gilligree and the leprechauns and the fairy folk, and tell her how to recognize a leprechaun and how to recognize the folk from the other world, and how to be careful around them and be respectful around them, and how to recognize them so that you're never in any danger from them, because people would disappear forever or for decades if they slip into the fairy world, she would tell her. And she would listen to stories about folks in the village that had run into leprechauns, and she learned about how to recognize a leprechaun. Her grandmother told her that you can tell a leprechaun because they will have neither button nor buckle, because everything they have has to be natural, like from the natural world. She told stories about how long ago the old folk, the wee folk, and the human folk all lived side by side. And then when they cut down all the trees for the great wars, the fairy folk and the leprechauns moved underground. But the great trees, the great oak trees that were left from the groves that were cut, became the portals, became the pathway between the worlds. And the fairy folk and the leprechauns would use these ancient oaks to travel between our world and their world underground. She told Annie that you can recognize the leprechauns by what they're wearing. No button, no buckle. And then she said, and her grandmother told her the only way to catch a leprechaun. She said, now some people think that you can sneak up on them and grab them from behind, but the minute you grab them, poof, they're gone. Because they're otherworld beings. These are not physical beings. These don't have substance. You can't catch them. They just poof, disappear. Some people think you can make a trap for them and have them go in the trap, and there they'll stay, and then you can get your wishes from them, because the main thing you can get from a leprechaun is 3 wishes. 3 wishes. And Annie said to her grandmother, well, how do you catch a leprechaun? And she said, the only way you can catch a leprechaun is to look him in the eye and tell him, I know who you are, and I'll be having your wishes. She said that long ago leprechauns lived up in heaven. They were little angels. And they fought in between the lines at the great battle where St. Michael beat Lucifer and sent him back down to the underplace. And when the battle was over, God said, well, you didn't fight on the side of good, but you didn't fight on the side of bad, and you were kind of tricksters, so I'll put you on earth, and you can pick any place you want to live on earth. And they traveled around the whole planet on a cloud until they found the most beautiful place on the planet. So green, green like you would never see. And they settled in Ireland. And the leprechauns have been there since the beginning of time. And they have seen all time. So to catch a leprechaun, you look them square in the eye and you tell them, I know who you are. And they cannot lie. She said the only way to kill an immortal soul, the leprechaun is an immortal soul. The only way to kill an immortal soul is by telling a lie. So they won't lie to you, but they will try to trick you, she said. Some people think you say, Brian Boru, I know it is you, but Brian Boru is the king of the leprechauns. If it's not Brian Boru, then poof, they're gone. And you've lost them. And then they know you're looking, and you'll never see them again. So Annie loved these stories, and she grew up a little bit, but she always thought of her friend Tommy. And she thought of how loving he was to her and how wonderful. And they sent letters a few times, and it took so long for a letter to go from one place to another. But Tommy's grandparents still lived in County Cork, and so she would get the news about him and the family as they all grew. And when she was a young girl, all of the other girls were flirting around with the local boys in the village and thinking, oh, Michael O'Flanagan, he's kind of sweet on you, Annie. You should bat your eyes at him, and then and maybe he'll come and see about courting you. Come talk to your mother or your grandfather about courting you. And she said, I don't want to court any of the lads here. And they said, why not? He's a fine lad. His family has property and farm. You'll be a fine lady if you marry somebody like. And she says, I'm not marrying anybody but Tommy Lyons. Because on the boat, on the way over, when they were leaving New York Harbor, she looked back at America as it disappeared. And she said to herself, one day, I'm going to marry Tommy Lyons. And she never forgot that. So when her friend said to her that this fellow or that fellow was interested in her, she had no interest in that. She said, I'm going to marry Tommy Lyons. And her friend said, you're a fool, you are. You're going to die an old maid because you're never going to see him again. He's never coming back here and you're never going back there. And that's just the way that it is. Well, Annie didn't believe that for a minute. She didn't want to believe that. She said, I'd rather die alone than live with someone that wasn't the love of my life, like Tommy Lyons is. There you have it. She was very feisty. She was little, but she was feisty. So one Sunday afternoon, Annie and her friends were having tea together, and of course a little bit of sherry, because that's just what you would do as a young lady. And she was walking back, and it was in the summertime, and it was hot, and Annie hated the heat. I don't know if it was because of the fire, or if it was because of she just didn't like it when it was hot. It just brought back terrible things. And in those days, the young ladies, they had to wear high collars and long sleeves and black stockings and pantaloons and underskirts and over jackets and all these layers and layers of clothes. And where she was walking, it was the way the road was it was up high off the fields. It was, instead of being sunken and the fields going up around, it was like raised up somehow so that it wouldn't be muddy. It would like roll off. Now she was also wearing her fancy high button shoes, and she complained about these shoes. Oh, did she complain about these shoes? She wore, when she was an old lady, she always wore black stockings and a long skirt and a little sweater. And I remember her shoulders were she was like my size when I was 8 years old. And she always wore these sensible, heavy shoes. She talked about the shoes walking down the road that day, where you had to button them up your ankle. And they were so tight and they were so pointy. And her toes were killing her. And every pebble on the road she could feel underneath between the thin layer of leather at the bottom of the shoes. The rocks were just poking through her feet. Her feet were bruised. And she's walking along, fanning herself with her hand, saying, oh, saints preserve us. Oh, Mary and Joseph, can you please? Oh, I can see it now. The priest will come by and he'll say, there's poor little Annie Murphy. Died she did of the heat in the ditch. And she's walking along just sweating and thinking, I'll never survive. I'll never make it home. It's like over a mile back to her house. And she's walking and it's nothing but fields, until up ahead she sees a big oak tree. Big, ancient oak with branches spreading out and glorious shade beneath it. So she makes her way. She says, if I could just make it to the tree, I know I can get a little shade and rest my feet a little bit, and then I can make it the rest of the way home. And she got to where the tree was, and she stepped down off the road, and the moss was so soft that her feet just sunk into the moss. And she could feel the coolness of it through the thin leather of the sole of her shoes. She took the hat pin out of her hat and took off her hat and waved it. She says, oh, this is so much better in the shade. She went over to the tree and she leaned on the tree and she said, oh, it must be 10 degrees cooler here. If I can just, but I need to rest. I need to rest just a minute. And she looked around. Now she was wearing her Sunday dress, her white Sunday dress with a green sash. And if she would sit down in the mud and get green stains and mud stains on that dress, her mother would surely take a switch to her. So she felt the ground by the tree, and surely it was dry. And she looked around up and down the road, and she didn't see anybody. Now, back in those days, it was, if you were barefooted, it was scandalous. If anyone saw your feet, it would be like running around in your front yard in your underwear today. And so she had to take those shoes off. Her feet were just pinched and killing her. So she looked up the road and down the road and all around, and there wasn't a soul in sight. And she thought, I could just take my shoes off for just a minute and put my skirts over my feet. So she does it. She unbuttons her shoes, and they're tight, and she takes them off. And then she looks, and no one is still there, and she took off her stockings to. And she put her hot, bruised, pinched, tired feet in the cool green moss. She sat down very carefully next to the tree and leaned up against its beautiful, wide, black trunk. And she sat there fanning herself with her hat. And she said, "Oh, this is so much better. I know I'll be fine. I'll be just fine," she said to herself. And then she started to yawn. And she fell sound asleep. The next thing she knew, she felt an icy wind on her face, just rushing across her face. And she startled awake, and she thought to herself, "Oh no, the sun's going down now where they lived." When the sun would go down, the cold wind would shift and come off the North Sea, and it was always a cold wind. And if she was out after the sun went down, her mother would surely take a switch to her. And she was like, "Oh no, I must have fallen asleep." And she looks around and she looks up, and there, standing in front of her, is a little man. Not a teeny little man, but a little man about 4 feet tall, 3.5, 4 feet tall, like the size of a child. And he stood there, giving her the stink eye. And he was leaning on a shillelagh. Now, a shillelagh is an Irish walking stick. And in the old times when there were robbers along the road, the shillelagh was a perfect walking stick because it was also a weapon. It's made from a branch of the blackthorn. And you get the knot from the blackthorn at the top. It's a very, very hard wood. And then you keep the thorns on, not the sharp parts, but the little prickly parts. And you can use it as a walking stick, and the knot can be the handle. But if a robber comes, you just take that knot and bonk them on the dome, and it'll not crack their head right open, and you are safe. So he's standing there leaning on his shillelagh. And she looked at him and she said, oh, excuse me. And she remembered her feet, and she covered her feet with her skirt. And she looked up and she said, "Excuse me, I was so hot in the heat. I just had to cool off for her just a minute. Excuse me, but and he said to her, "What will you be doing by me tree?" She said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't know this was your property. I thought this was the O'Brien farm. I just needed to cool off for just a minute." And he said, "I didn't say it was me property. I said it was me tree." Now, Annie Murphy remembered her grandmother's stories. And she took a look at this little man in front of her leaning on a shillelagh. And she looked up and down, and she saw not a buckle nor a button. He had a ruddy red face with red whiskers that had like white in them, like gray in the red whiskers on his chin. He wore a cap that was like hand felted, and it would be pointed if it wasn't just rolled just a little bit. It looked almost like the way she described it, I pictured like a Robin Hood type hat, but without the point. It was just kind of rolled and on his head. And she said the cap was the color of the leaves, exact color of the leaves of the oak tree. And in it, there was the brightest blue feather, unlike anything she had ever seen, the exact color of the August sky in his cap. And then she looked, and he wore a shirt that tied at the neck and tied at the wrists. No buttons, no buckles. It was the color of the field beyond, the beautiful golden color of the ripening barley. He wore a waistcoat, a vest, and the vest laced up with a leather strap. And the vest was dark, the color of the tree trunk. He wore odd short pants, not short pants, but they came down just below his knee. There was no buckle. It wasn't like anything she'd ever seen anyone wear, and they were the color of the dark green moss. And he wore hand-woven stockings or knitted stockings that the pants went over, and the stockings were the color of the earth itself. And then she looked down, and he had leather shoes, the color of the litter at the bottom of the tree. No buckle, no button, handmade, And she thought to herself, saints preserve us, I'm looking at a leprechaun. And her heart flipped, and she quickly stood up. And she looked him in the eye and she said, I know who you are, and I'll be having me wishes. He said, who do you think I be then? And she says, don't you try to trick me. I know you're full of tricks. Just let me just say I know who you are, and I'll be having me wishes. And from that moment on, she could not break eye contact with him, or she would lose him. He said, you're a smart lass, you are. Now, my great-grandma said the most difficult thing she did was to look him in the eye, because as she looked deep in those blue, blue eyes, she could see deep in there the light of heaven, the fires of hell, and the thousands and thousands of years that this creature had seen. And it gave her butterflies in her stomach, and it made her heart beat fast. And she wanted to look away. She wanted to look away. It was so overwhelming, but she knew that if she looked away, he would be gone. So she looked him in the eye. And she knew that if you are somebody who is pure of heart, if you have good intentions, you can look into the light of heaven, into the fires of hell, and into the ages of all eternity, and not be afraid. And she was a good-hearted, honest person, and so she did. And she repeated, I know who you are, and I'll be having me wishes. He said, you're a smart lass, you are. What'll you be wanting? A fine big house on top of the hill so you could sit up there and look down on all the common folk? And she says, oh no, it's not a fine big house that I'll be wanting. And then he looked her up and down, and he saw her bare feet. And it made her nervous. She almost looked down, but she didn't. She kept looking him in the eye. And he said, you want some fine clothes then, and maybe some fine leather shoes for those bare toes of yours. And she said, never you mind my toes. And it's not clothing I want either. He said, you want me pot of gold. You want to be rich beyond comprehension then. She said, oh no, it's not money I want either. He said, you are a smart lass. Well then, quit wasting me time. I'm standing out here in the bright daylight, and I need to get on my way, so tell me your wish and let me be gone. And she said, very well, I wish to marry Tommy Lyons. And the leprechaun looked disappointed. I thought you were a smart lass. Look at you. You're a fine-looking girl. All you have to do is walk in the village, bat your eyelashes at whatever fella you walk past, and they'll follow you like a puppy. What are you wasting a wish on something foolish like that? And she said, you don't understand. Tommy Lyons is all the way across the ocean in America. And the only way I'm going to get back there to meet him, to be with him again, is by a wish from a leprechaun. And he said, that's a different story then. But it's still a foolish wish, he said. You can wish for Marion, but you can't wish for love. Love only comes when you make it happen. And she said, you take care of the Marion part, and I'll take care of the loving part. He says, you're sure that's your wish? She says, I'm sure that's my wish. He said, very well. Your wish is granted. Now look away and let me go and get out of this heat. And she says, not on your life. I know I've got 2 more wishes coming. And he says, oh, you're greedy too. And she says, I'm not greedy. You said already, I'm just smart. Now, Annie Murphy, Annie Murphy knew her first wish. She did not have to think about it. But the other wishes that she would ask the leprechaun for, she had to think. And you know how when you think, you go into your head? And she did that. And she sort of shifted her gaze up towards the sky. And at that time, the leprechaun took his shillelagh stirred up the dirt at his feet, and he went and blew up a cloud of dust that went right in her eyes. And she says, "Ah, you're trying to blind me here. What are you doing?" And she looked, and he was gone. He was nowhere to be seen. She looked to the left, to the right. She turned around. She looked down the road. She ran behind the tree. He was gone, disappeared, absolutely vanished. But laying there on the ground in front of her was none other than his shillelagh. She looked at it. She picked it up in one hand. She picked up her shoes and stockings in the other, and she ran barefoot all the rest of the way back home. And she burst into the kitchen, and her mother said, "Where have you been, Annie? It's time to get dinner ready. Get upstairs." And she, "Oh, you're barefooted. What are you doing with that?" And Annie comes in. She shows her the shillelagh. She says, "Look, Mama, I got a wish from a leprechaun." And she says, "Ah, stuff and nonsense. That's fairy stories for children and old women. Now get upstairs before I take a switch to you." And Annie says, "No, Ma, really, I caught a leprechaun and I got a wish." And her mother said, "Upstairs with you, upstairs with you." And Annie was so overwhelmed. She was like, her heart was beating so fast. And she walked to go up the stairs to the loft, and her grandmother was sitting by the hearth. And her grandmother said, "Annie, come, come, come. Tell me what happened." And she told her the story, and she handed her the shillelagh, and her grandmother held it in her hand and said, "Surely this is the shillelagh of a leprechaun." She said, "What a wonderful thing." She said, "Annie, you keep this with you all the time. You have 2 more wishes coming, and as long as you have the shillelagh, that leprechaun is going to keep coming back to try to get it back." "Well, what's to keep him from just taking it in the night when I'm sleeping?" she asked. And her grandmother said, "Go get a tin can out of the bin and bring it here with the shears." And so Annie went and got a tin can, and her grandmother cut a strip from the can and bent it and put it around the tip of the shillelagh and stuck a nail, hammered like a little nail, and when she hammered at the end, it split, hammered that tin ring around the bottom. And she said, "Now he can't get it unless you take the tin off and give it back." And Annie put that shillelagh up next to her bed. And she waited, and she waited. And a few weeks later on Sunday, she was in church, and she heard the old ladies talking. They said, "Did you hear poor Grandpa Lyons? He fell off his hay wagon and broke his ankle, and everybody else is bringing in the hay and bringing in the crops, and there's nobody to help him with all of his sons, and his grandsons emigrated all the way to America. Here he is all by himself. They're going to have a rough winter." And one of the other ladies said, "I heard that one of his grandsons is coming to help bring in the crops." And Annie's ears perked up. And she said, "Pardon me, ladies. I hate to eavesdrop, but could you tell me which of his grandsons might be coming?" And one of them said, "I'm not sure, but I think it's young Tom." Well, Annie didn't like the thought of Grandpa Lyons having a broken ankle because she knew that the leprechaun had something to do with that. But she certainly liked the thought of young Tom coming to bring in the crops, which he did. And when he came, he found her, and he visited with her, and they would sit on the porch, and they would walk down the lane together, and they would talk, and her heart grew and grew, and his grew and grew. And so, before he was going back, he got down on one knee, and he said, "Dear lovely Miss Annie Murphy, would you do me the great honor and pleasure to be me bride and me love for the rest of our days?" And she said, "Surely I will, Mr. Lyons." Well, she and her mother returned to Chicago after a year of saving money. And she said, "When I went back, I had the hat on my head, the coat on my back, the shoes on my feet. a little satchel with some beautiful lacy things that my grandmother had given me. And in my hand, I had this shillelagh. And the whole time she was telling the story, she was holding the shillelagh. And she would hold it up. And I remember looking at it and thinking, oh, that's a leprechaun's shillelagh. And she said, you can feel of it if you're real careful. And I remember putting my hands on the shillelagh and getting butterflies and tingles running through my arms. And it was, I could tell it was magical. Her story was magical. The tale was magical. I heard that story many times. Well, Annie Murphy did marry Tommy Lyons. They raised 5 children. Their second daughter was Angela. Angela had 2 children. Her first child was David. David had 10 children. His third was me. When Annie died, Angela had the shillelagh. When Angela died, my father David had the shillelagh. And a few years ago, when my father passed away, I received the most precious of all inheritances. I received the shillelagh, and this is it. This was the leprechaun shillelagh. This came back to Chicago with Annie. It stayed by her side her whole life. If you look, I don't know if you can see it, but here is the tin still on the bottom. Let me get it to where I don't know, can you see it? There's a strip of, you see how it's split when she put the nail in? And there's the tin on the bottom, so the leprechaun can't just take it. But I have to tell you that in my lifetime, I've seen fairy folk. I've never seen a leprechaun. I have never seen this leprechaun who belongs to this. But I do know that I'm sure he has come across the ocean with the Murphys, with the Lionses, and is here in America. And so I keep this by my side when I'm telling the story of Annie Murphy and the leprechaun. It's a true story. Thank you. Thanks for listening and joining us this evening. There are things beyond what we see with our eyes. Watch for them. They're there. They can be seen. We only need to recognize them. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all of you next week. I will be keeping this very nearby. I keep it here in my office, but in the next week or so, I think I'll be keeping it a little closer. Who knows? Maybe this is the year that I see a leprechaun. Be well, be kind. Take care, everybody. I'll see you next time.